So again, I'm just going to put my timer here. As I said, I'd rather be called Ricardo than Fidel, right? As you know, Fidel stands for that great gentleman who would go on for 4 hours. This is like my 12th talk this week so far, and it's quite hard because we are like 4 hours ahead, and I make sure that almost every night we do our own vlogs, political vlogs, discussions, the latest in Philippines, domestic politics and foreign affairs. So if I'm not at my sharpest, or if I'm overshooting, apologies for that, but I look forward to your criticisms and violent reactions just in case once we're done with this talk. So today I'm going to discuss essentially 50 shades of hedging strategies that is employed by Southeast Asian countries with a particular focus on the Philippines. Currently I have a book with the Melbourne University Press, putting pressure on them, they have to get it out. It's a case study of Vietnam, Malaysia. Actually it starts from Taiwan. It's a kind of this arc of resistance, or essentially, all sorts of different ways by which different countries in the region are coping with the rise of China, right? So I'll mostly focus on the case of the Philippines today and the concept of hedging and how is this relevant in the case of the Philippines. I think this is the way, okay. All right, so art of hedging, ASEAN, the Philippines. So first of all, let's be a little bit pretentious, talk about the conceptual framework. When we talk about hedging strategy, it's essentially dialectical and asymmetric interaction, meaning, it's easy to take a snapshot of one country in Southeast Asia and to say, oh, this is Team China, because this is what Anwar says, and this is what their military did yesterday. And then you take a snapshot of Philippines in 2018. I mean, actually, initially I was supposed to be here in 2020, and then, I don't know, there was some virus thing that came out, and next thing you know, like the whole thing got canceled. I'm glad that perhaps it didn't push through, because I would have had to spend, 30 minutes explaining Duterte. At least I don't have to explain that guy anymore. Now, if you look at hedging, it's a dialectical process, and it's very asymmetric in a sense that when countries say we don't want to make a choice, it doesn't mean that they equally treat different superpowers, right? And if you look at the Southeast Asian region, there's also a lot of what some colleagues call performative hedging. So I think the Singaporeans are, for instance, very good in that. If they sign an MOA with the Americans, it has to be an MOU with the Chinese, just to say that there's a balancing. Although, of course, if you really dig into it, you'll realize that bulk of their weapon systems is not really from China, right? So there's a lot of that kind of a performativity also to the hedging strategy. Or you have someone like Duterte coming out and saying, we want to join and align with Russia and China. He kind of forgot North Korea along the way, against the West, But next thing you know, the Philippine military is still conducting 200, 300 military activities a year. So you have to be very careful when we look at foreign policy alignments or predisposition of these different countries. There's a lot of performativity that goes on, especially if you just focus on the journalistic coverage of these countries. Nevertheless, I want to also talk about this very interesting dynamic. So over the past few months, I've been back and forth to the United States, great power country, from South Carolina to Stanford and Berkeley. And obviously my challenge sometimes with certain audiences in America, whether it's in Washington, D.C. and some of the other states, is to remind them that the world is not just US and China, right? Because again, one of the things that sometimes raises my eyebrows with our Singaporean friends is they always talk about this, I think it's a Swahili, right? That this idea of the two elephants and the grass, right? The idea that, essentially we're in a world whereby there are two giant elephants and the rest of us are the grass. So if the elephants make love, we suffer. If they go into war, we suffer. And I always felt that's very problematic, because I think the world of geopolitics, if you're going to be metaphorical about it, is more like a Lion King's kingdom, right? Like there are elephants, obviously, but there are also all sorts of different predators with different levels of strategic agency. But having said that, obviously, New Zealand's strategic agency is not exactly the same as, let's say, Indonesia. Or Indonesia is not, I wanted to say Australia, but I didn't want to get into trouble. You know what I'm saying? So there's a variety, right? It's a spectrum. It's not a 1 or 0 binary issue. So some countries have more strategic agency, the ability to determine their strategic fate and not to be pressured or dictated upon by superpowers. So that's where I talk about the concept of bounded agency, right? So maybe United States and China are, let's say, 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10, if that's possible in our globalized world, and then other countries are essentially from 1 to 8 or 1 to 7. So when you have a more spectral or spectrum-based understanding of strategic agency, there's more room, not only for theoretical discussion, but also for appreciating the nuances in the foreign policy positioning of different countries. So that's why I came up with the idea of 50 shades of hedging, right? But nevertheless, one of the problems we have in the international relations theory is the distinction between hedging and soft balancing. So don't worry, I'm not going to bore you guys by getting too much into it. The whole purpose of this discussion is to make us rethink some of the preconceptions or some of the snapshot-based analysis we have of this interesting part of the world. So again, very quickly through the review of related literature. So if you look at Professor Chuik's argument, when he looks at hedging, he talks about conscious and instinctive commitments to offset risks by pursuing multiple policy options that are intended to produce mutually counteracting effects under a situation of high uncertainty, high stakes. In short, just to simplify it, you see a lot of countries in the region, one day sounding like Team China, another day sounding like Team America. And others say, they go into their audience and say, no, we're just here for our own country, make our country great again. And a lot of that is deliberate, but a lot of that is also instinctive, especially when you don't want to be dictated upon by other countries, and especially if, like Malaysia or Indonesia, you have a non-aligned foreign policy orientation and you don't have alliance with any of the superpowers. It is fundamentally something rational. My contention is that it could be also opportunistic, but fundamentally it's an insurance-seeking strategic behavior. It's a third option, right? It's a middle position. That's how different scholars will put it. But importantly, it has to be proactive, right? Because it's so easy to say, then everyone is hedging, right? There has to be some conscious, instinctive, and proactiveness to it. You have to consciously look for opportunities to engage and balance your relationship between different powers. So fence-sitting is not necessarily a form of hedging, right? Having said that, when you deal with post-colonial countries, where strategic culture is not very mature, there are few think tanks, there's not incentive for deep strategic discussions and introspection. In countries where the bureaucracy is very susceptible to infighting, to corruption, to manipulations, influence operations, it is difficult to come up with a very sophisticated and robust hedging strategy. So sometimes there will be incoherence. Sometimes there will be irrationality. And I think the case of the Philippines under Duterte administration is very clear. The defense minister will say one thing, the foreign minister will say another thing, and Duterte will say another thing, and all of them were honest in what they said. And the Philippine foreign policy is the dialectical synthesis of all of that. So I was doing a lot of Hegel during Duterte's time, essentially either Freud or Hegel, because I said it's so crazy. I have to be either psychoanalyst or a metaphysicist to make sense out of what was happening, because political science was not helping me as much. So, nevertheless, you cannot have hedging forever. In Filipino, we have an expression, walang forever. There's no forever. Of course, it's about love and romance and everything like that. But also in geopolitics, walang forever, right? Because you can only do hedging below a certain threshold. So what are these thresholds? First of all, you have to have certain structural preconditions. There is more or less a multipolar order, providing some room for maneuver. And multipolarity is something we can debate about, but actually in Southeast Asia, there is a high degree of multipolarity, because I don't know if anyone looks at Japan as a superpower, but actually Japan is the leading source of trade and investment for a lot of regional states. And if you look at the actual investments by Japan in countries like the Philippines or Vietnam, it outstrips that of China by a mile. So my joke always to my Japanese friends is, be a bit less Japanese, be a bit more Italian. Not in terms of their infrastructure, but in terms of performativity, right? Because one thing we see in the region is that our Chinese friends get a lot of bang out of imaginary buck. So in the Duterte era, for instance, we had pledge trap, a lot of empty pledges. Forget about debt trap, a lot of empty pledges in exchange for geopolitical concessions. Oh, China promised $24 billion, so maybe I will try to impress them by pressing the Americans on the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Or, maybe I'll threaten our visiting forces agreement. So, pledge trap is a real phenomenon. And we saw in the case of the Philippines, for instance. It's also important that there's a degree of ambivalence as far as threat is concerned. And I think that is where Kiwis and Filipinos perhaps will diverge significantly. We have many similarities we can discuss later on, but you're like third island chain, we're like first island chain. We're like next to Taiwan, we're a claimant in the South China Sea. So the ambivalence or ambiguity part is significantly diminished in the case of the Philippines compared to, say, in New Zealand. So I understand if you guys are a little bit more iffy on AUKUS or all of these issues that we discussed. In the Philippines, increasingly, it's impossible for us to, to too much hedge our bets. So some would say maybe some countries will be forced to align fully. But we can have a discussion about that. And then there's still great power rivalry, and this is the most important, but not armed conflict. Right? Because once armed conflicts happen, and if you have treaty alliances or robust security partnerships, neutrality is no longer an option, right? It's close to impossible. Or you may end up like Belgium, was it during First World War, right? A lot of neutral states didn't turn out very well, unless you're Switzerland and somewhere there, right? So neutrality is not opting out is most of the time not an option when a major power conflict erupts, as we know historically. Nevertheless, hedging is something that is getting very natural for practically all of us in Southeast Asia, because nevertheless, there's a fear of Chinese hegemony. In fact, the most articulate people when it comes to the issue of fears of Chinese hegemony are the Singaporeans, again. So, he's Australian, like Julian Assange. Anyway, more than 10 years ago, some folks asked me to go through all the WikiLeaks cables from 1970 to 2012 or something like that. And it's quite a treasure trove, right? So it was a book about WikiLeaks, right? You can find it. The title is actually WikiLeaks. And I got the Southeast Asia part. Oh my God, the things I found there. And one of the most interesting things was Lee Kuan Yew in 2007, if not mistaken, telling to the Americans, give us options. Because if you don't give us free trade agreements, you don't give us alternatives, we'll inevitably be sucked into the Chinese sphere of influence. Of course, he didn't say it exactly that way, but that was the message. Give us options, give us alternative. So even Chinese majority Singapore, which many misinterpret as being pro-China nowadays, which they're not obviously, they're behind the scenes, they're very, very concerned also about the fact that because China is a geographic reality, US is a geopolitical accident. US is powerful here because of Second World War outcome. But China is powerful here because, well, it's China, size, history, geography. And that's even more pronounced if you're Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, even Thailand, right? So even in Southeast Asia, the reason you also have this 50 shades of hedging is because of tyranny of distance and distance from tyranny, right? That dynamic is very real. The other thing, and this is where I get a bit emotional, is the ineffectiveness of pre-existing multilateral mechanisms. The ASEAN situation is just super depressing nowadays. When I was a student not long ago, constructivism was the name of the game, right? Good friends like Amitav Acharya were having a field day in terms of writing about, norms and, and the role of ASEAN in creating some sort of inclusive security arc, us being in the driving seat. And recently, I think he tweeted saying, no, ASEAN is no longer in the driving seat, we're in the passenger seat. I said, no, we're actually in the back seat, right? In a sense that if you look at ASEAN nowadays, there's almost ontological and existential level of debate, right? And it's even funny because some of our friends, they have a metaphor, is ASEAN a horse or is it a cow, right? Because a horse is like you train it, it gets across the line, get things done. A cow is like, well, you have fantastic cows here, but the cows that we know in Southeast Asia, like Carabao, is like, he munches here, he munches there, he maybe goes here, he maybe doesn't go there, right? So questions nowadays are about what is really the purpose of ASEAN? How far can really ASEAN go, right? So it's an existential moment. In fact, it's even a toxic moment. So recently there was the Shangri-La Dialogue, and then right after that, the Asia-Pacific Roundtable. Not many Filipinos were invited to the Asia-Pacific Roundtable. We can have a long conversation about that, especially those who are very critical of China. But our understanding is that a discourse that is gaining ground in certain circles is ASEAN minus the Philippines. The idea that the Filipinos, the pesky Filipinos, they're essentially the front for America. They're the deputy sheriff of the United States in the region, right? This idea that we don't reflect regional norms and principles, right? Now, in my opinion, that's strategic gaslighting. Just because you're useless, not helping us in the South China Sea for your own national interests, do not blame us for doing that for our own national interests and putting pressure on ASEAN to be more helpful to us. In the Philippines, there's a mirror debate of that. At my most critical moment, I say ASEAN is useless in terms of helping us with the South China Sea issue, right? But it's useful on many fronts, economic fronts, cultural fronts, no question about it. But it's definitely not a horse when it comes to matter. It's not even a donkey when it comes to dealing with the South China Sea issue. In the Philippines, many of the strategic thinkers are saying, no. Richard, you're actually overly optimistic. ASEAN is worse than useless. It's an enabler of China. So for instance, many people look at the Code of Conduct negotiations in the South China Sea as akin to the two-state solution, right? It's kind of there in the air while facts on the ground are being built on a daily basis, clearly to the favor of one side at the expense of others. So in short, ASEAN is creating a kind of an illusion of diplomatic engagement and peace, which actually clouds or apologizes and justifies what China is doing on the ground on a daily basis in terms of literally creating facts on the ground, as you can see in those giant islands, among other things. So this is another reason where hedging would make sense, because you really cannot trust the existing multilateral organizations in terms of creating the rules of the game or enforcing some sort of rules-based international order. In fact, if you go to ASEAN today, you're almost in parallel universes. In Kuala Lumpur and in Jakarta, the conversation is all about Gaza and how Gaza is a reflection of the complete hypocrisy of the West. That's the line you hear there. You go to Manila, we're super happy to have Zelensky in town. We're thinking about how he can help Ukraine. We're thinking about Taiwan. And clearly, as far as the Philippine government is concerned, they keep on emphasizing Israel's supposed right to self-defense. So completely different geopolitical realities, just 3 hours flight away, right? This is the level of divisions, even psychological and political divisions we're seeing in some of the key countries who also happen to be both claimant states, both Malaysia and the Philippines, and also founding members. Now, the debate also nowadays is whether some countries in ASEAN are no longer in a position to hedge and are already forced to make alignment. So on one extreme, some would say Cambodia has already aligned with the Chinese, no matter what Hun Sen or his sons want, because they're just too embedded into that school. We can have a debate about that. And then the others are saying the Philippines is already self-balancing and this is no longer hedging. My contention is, again, we can have a discussion about, is that I think we're still in hedging, except we're hitting a certain threshold. Because so far, the threat of armed conflict is still below a certain threshold, in my opinion. I'll discuss to you also how the Philippines can leverage it to its national benefit. Now, very quickly, because I want to leave more time for discussions. If you look at Vietnam, bamboo diplomacy is one way they put it, right? And we can have a long conversation about that. I've written extensively on that. You can check that. My thing with Vietnam is the amateurish, or for lack of a better word, journalistic understanding of in Vietnam is, Vietnam, they stood up to China for 1,000 years. And then I saw a version in a 1984 5-piece on Washington Post. No, not 1,000, 4,000 years we have stood up to the Chinese. And I said, okay, we can have a long debate about whether there was a China or Vietnam back then. But the reality is that if you look at Vietnam today, especially in the last 3 years, this is not the Vietnam we used to know in the Philippines 10 or even 5 years ago. The Vietnam of 10 or 5 years ago was a Vietnam that we saw as a natural ally. Forget about ASEAN, we unilaterally go straight to Vietnam and work together on the China question, right? And then we can go intersectional and work with Quad and other powers. Good luck having that with Vietnam nowadays. Because their geography with China is structuring their choices in ways it has not done for a long time, including the massive inflow of intermediate goods, not to mention almost finished products, which the Vietnamese repackage for their exports. So a huge part of Vietnam's story as a rising manufacturing power is also their growing economic dependence on China. Not to mention, and in my opinion, this is even more important, if we look at the case of Vietnam, they're also going through tremendous amount of political upheaval domestically. This is like Soviet Union when Khrushchev came to power and said something against Stalin, and people, huge things are happening in Vietnam as we speak, right? And for some of us who have been dealing with Vietnam throughout the past 10 years, we can really feel it. You're getting different versions from different departments and all of that. It's like something big is happening inside Vietnam right now. Now, you can have a sociological argument and say, well, it's just natural for a communist or post-communist country in a period of rapid economic growth to have this kind of politics. We can go through that. But in a very simple way, if you look at the emerging securocrats who are taking over Vietnam, they have actually taken over already, their primary concern is not necessarily China or the South China Sea. Their primary concern is color revolutions. Vietnam is adding almost 3 million people to its middle class every day. This is a very globalized, English-speaking So a lot of the secretocrats with kind of a KGB style training, it's hard not to blame them for wondering if this middle class population will not start asking questions or asking for more political voice. That's why if you look at a lot of statements coming out of Vietnamese leadership's meetings with China, color revolutions keeps on coming up. And I don't think this is performative or anything else. There seems to be very fundamental sense of threat from the regime. And one-party states being paranoid, surprise, surprise, right? Things happen. So, as we can see, Vietnam is becoming a different kind of a player in this part of the world. Having said that, though, in fairness to Vietnam, they are trying to play also leadership role within ASEAN. So this year they started this initiative of essentially a profound intellectual discussion about the fundamentals of ASEAN and what we can do to make this regional body. So in that sense, they're also emerging as a leader within ASEAN, but not in the direction that we Filipinos were thinking, or definitely what Americans were thinking, which is Vietnam as a bulwark against China. I think that was very simplistic, and that's completely out of touch with the new realities as far as Vietnam is concerned. Of course, the famous word nowadays is multi-alignment. Thanks to our Indian friends, we can have a long conversation about India, but just to simplify it, I think there's also a wake-up call that India is not the kind of ally that the West thought India would be. I mean, this is a kind of an ally or friend, which, by the way, is very clear always, we're not an ally of the West, right? I mean, I asked Jai Shankar in Munich Security Conference 2022 about what do you think about people saying Quad is a new Asian NATO? Oh, he went on ranting for the next 30 minutes and no one else could talk, right? And then the next week, there's an invasion of Ukraine. Next thing you know, India is importing even more oil from Russia. And some stuff are getting refined and sold to Europe. And then when India is criticized, they fight back, right? So then I think we're seeing the limits of how much alignment really is. And as far as India is concerned, their focus is on Pakistan and Himalayas and their disputes with China. They're not really in position to really join kind of a US-led integrated deterrent strategy. But that's where Philippines comes in, because for a long time in the Philippines, we say, our geography is such a blessing, right? We're at the crossroads of everything. Well, it sometimes can become a curse too, right? Just look at how unfortunate the Philippines is, or rather, what a big challenge we're gonna face. So we're not only right at the first island chain, the Philippine Sea is more or less the second island chain. And China is being active all around here. Now, there are some geniuses in Down Under who have been saying, let China have the first island chain. This is their natural, and everything will be fine. Well, except China is already active here, and I think it's already active also here, right? So what will stop them from dominating here to create a caution for here, especially because you have the Taiwan question too, right? So when China operates, it's looking at the whole zone. It's not like, okay, I'll have this, you have that. It doesn't work that way. The salami slicing doesn't work that way. And the misfortune of the Philippines is we're caught in exactly in between those two. But that's also where the importance of the Philippines comes in the picture, because now we're central suddenly to two theaters which is now integrated. The Taiwan question and the South China Sea question. And that is why suddenly the Philippines is very central to Washington DC's regional strategy. And that's also why China is also very worried about that. Okay, I'll quickly go through this. We can have more discussions about that. Obviously, I keep on hearing from my pro-China friends, but the usual whataboutism, right? Well, of course, but what about Vietnam? They also have artificial islands. Yeah, except, the Chinese artificial islands are level of like NBA basketball, while the Vietnamese one are barely like, I don't know. Do you have good basketball here? Yeah, you have a decent team, right? But you see their levels to the game, right? Or let's say PBA basketball, Philippine basketball level, right? It's incomparable, right? What the Chinese are building compared to the other countries. So just to shut down that nonsensical whataboutism there. Oh, and there are concerns that what we're looking at here really is a form of, China creating a sphere of influence. We can have a debate about that. But speaking of the Philippines, I know there are a lot of stereotypes of the Philippines, and we don't have to be excessively politically correct. I mean, after all, I don't blame our Chinese friends for having a caricature of the Philippines as an American satellite, or as a banana republic, or as a giant Cambodia, if they get the Hun Sen on top, everything else will follow. Because let's be honest, for a very long time, I mean, the misfortune of the Philippines is we had the first anti-colonial revolution in Asia. Jose Rizal was seen as the father of Asian nationalism by Indian and Chinese students in Tokyo in the early 20th century. That is the history we had, except the Americans stole it from us. Our misfortune is our revolution came just when America was a rising superpower, and they stumbled into the Philippines. So what happened in the Philippines is that for almost a century, you had an elite that had no sense of itself and its national interest. It was in many ways looking at how can it always position itself within the American empire. And the rise of the American empire cannot be understood without understanding the Philippines. A lot of counterterrorism strategies that US will use in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, they perfected that against Filipino revolutionaries who wanted to stand up to their hijacking of the revolution. But also the Philippines was extremely crucial to America's projection of power in this part of the world because Clark and Subic were the biggest overseas bases of the United States. So we are extremely central to the global security architecture that America created, except central at the expense of us developing our own strategic culture and developing our own sense of ourself and national destiny. That's a reality, and we cannot deny that. And if you look at all of these sets of defense agreements, they actually essentially meant the Philippine elite will just take care of themselves and domestic problems like insurgencies. Practically everything else was externalized to the Americans. And we paid a heavy, heavy price for that because by the 1990s, the Chinese were already moving in, right? And in the Mischief Reef in 1994, 1995, once the Americans left their bases, largely actually for economic reasons than geopolitical reasons, we can have a discussion about we were in no position to defend ourselves. And the Americans also said, you're essentially on your own, right? And we would see an iteration of that also in 2012 when the Scarborough Shoal happened. Now, if you want to look at the history of America's approach to the South China Sea question, especially vis-a-vis the Philippines, I wrote a piece about, so essentially from Kissinger to Barack Obama, America's position was strategic ambiguity. But it was really more ambiguous than strategic. I agree with Kissinger, but I don't agree with Obama in the sense that when Kissinger came up with that principle, his worry was the Philippines was the boogeyman and bully. Because in the 60s and 70s, we were still one of the most advanced militaries in that part of the world until the Marcos dictatorship just completely ruined the whole game. But we were very proactive in the South China Sea, and we built the first major air base in Spratlys in 1977 already. We had air bases there. So the Americans' concern was we will weaponize our mutual defense treaty for, as Kissinger put it, territorial self-aggrandizement. So that's why the Americans had to say, whoa, yo, I don't know about that, right? But the problem is the realities of 1970s were completely incomparable to the realities that you'll see in 1990s and most especially in 2012 when the Scarborough Shoal crisis happened. And our understanding is when it comes to Americans, they were very non-committal. And that forced us into all sorts of very difficult positions, which effectively allowed the Americans to take over the Scarborough Shoal. In my contention, this was the wake-up call for the Philippines, that Americans are not reliable. And good friends at CNAS, Richard Fontaine, they have a new book called The Lost Decade, how, that 2010s was really crucial to prevent certain, the ability of China to impose really its will in this area of the world, among others. But this was also a wake-up call for the Philippines. So this was a time where, interestingly, on one hand, the Philippines under the Aquino administration tried to internationalize the dispute, right? So that's where the arbitration award comes in. It also tried to double down on our security alliance, therefore the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. But one thing important that people don't emphasize as much is we also passed the revised AFP Modernization Act, allocating billions of dollars for purely procurement of modern weapon systems. The situation was so embarrassing that from mid-1990s until early 2010s, we didn't have a single supersonic fighter jet. And when we acquired one, I think in 2015, back then, God bless his soul, President Aquino said, finally, we're back to supersonic. Like, it was that bad, right? And this was a time also when the Philippines economy was growing. So if you have noticed, actually, we are the fastest growing country in ASEAN, not Vietnam. I mean, it's really toe-to-toe. And that growth spurt really started in 2010s. So Philippines was actually trying to also find its own footing. And then Duterte happens. Again, I'll be very quick about this because I'd rather have more discussions about this. Duterte, in a way, was kind of like that Carl Jungian shadow, right? This frustration that was there against America for their unreliability on. Not to mention a kind of authoritarian populist Jungian shadow. Now, I don't want to orientalize the Philippines that much, and that's always my contention with my journalist friends that, don't orient us. It's not like we want a crazy dictator, but there was so much broken about Philippines' quote-unquote democracy and so much broken about our alliance with the United States that it became so easy for Duterte to come in and say, we want a different direction. You need a strong man, and you have to stop relying on the United States. Now, to be very quick about this, you can just read my books, I explain everything there, but to be very quick about this, one reason why there was no massive backlash against Duterte's pro-China foreign policy is precisely because if you look at the surveys, US always gets a very high favorability rating. So when Filipinos are asked, do you like America? Of course we like America, blah, 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 okay. And then when they were asked in 2017, this is a Pulse Asia survey, very important, very authoritative, they were asked, do you think America has been helpful to us in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea? Suddenly, it collapses, right? And then, more interestingly, do you think the Philippines should instead develop security cooperation with Russia and China? A huge plurality were okay with that. So what Duterte did very smartly was, he accepted that Filipinos like America, but he also knew that Filipinos instinctively knew that US was not a reliable partner. And that was absolutely true. In fact, Duterte people would use my own articles in 2014 and 15 and say, you said that, right? I said, yeah, I mean, I cannot, you know what I'm saying, you know? I mean, Pakistan and Jordan have better American weapon systems than the Philippines, right? They have Abrams tanks. I think in Jordan, they have F-16 fighters. The Philippines, find me a single modern fighter from America. I think the last one was like 1970s or 80s, fine. You can say everything and gaslight the Philippines. Oh, you're a corrupt country, but seriously, I mean, we can talk about Jordan and Pakistan's good governance, indicator or per capita, right? Philippines is not so much worse than those countries. In fact, it's ahead of them on many indicators. So Philippines was really taken for granted. If Pakistan's problems was Taliban and Jordan's problem was Daesh, our problem is China, the biggest navy in the region, if not in the world, right? So there was really a lot of resentment there. And Duterte was just so good in weaponizing that. And I learned that in one of my random discussions on airport, I had a discussion about United Nations Convention Law of the Sea with a taxi driver, right? It was amazing. And me, I mean, in my annoying Socratic way, you know, like how Socrates goes to the bazaar and agora and just pretends that he's an idiot and then pushes people to contradict themselves. So I would just do that, like Socrates. I wouldn't contradict him. Oh, is that so? But what don't you do? So eventually he realized he was not making sense. So he suddenly blurted out, you know, I don't know about this, but this is what I hear from Duterte, and he sounds very reasonable to me. Kind of essentially like MAGA people, how they'll explain Trump's foreign policy. There I realized, oh my God, he's actually very influential, even shaping foreign policy views. Suddenly everyone feels they are experts in foreign policy. So that was the genius of Duterte's populism that I think many people did not appreciate. And people were saying, I thought you hate China, why are you pro-Duterte? But I say, yeah, but you know, you see, all of that, right? This and that and this and that. And Duterte was able to pull that off for a very, very long time until he couldn't pull that off anymore. Because by 2020, 2021, even Duterte had to recalibrate. And again, this is what's forgotten. Everyone says, oh, Marcos came, savior, everything is fine. No. Duterte himself realized by 2021, A, the investments were not coming in. That's why I call it pledge trap. And B, very importantly, in the ASEAN-China summit in 2021, October, you can Google it yourself, I've been writing on this, he said, we abhor, he used the word abhor, I'm speaking Philippine, what was happening in the South China Sea. And this is particularly the Whitsun Reef incident. You may not be very familiar with that, but the Whitsun Reef incident, in fact, was even more important in a certain sense than the Reed Bank incident in 2018. So very quickly, in 2019, more than a dozen Filipino fishermen almost got killed in the Reed Bank, very energy-rich area, which is part of our exclusive economic zone, but bullied by the Chinese, and that was really bad. Thanks to illegal Vietnamese fishermen, they didn't die. So the Chinese militia, we don't know if it had operational command or whatever, but that could have been a major diplomatic crisis. And the Americans, obviously, that was where the Americans come in. And they clarified that the mutual defense treaty will apply if there's any attack on our public vessels. So 2019 was very crucial. But Duterte being Duterte, he still insisted, this is manageable. In fact, he parroted China's line. He said it's a small maritime incident. It was one of the most embarrassing moments in Philippine foreign policy. And it was that time that I wrote my first, hopefully last protest column. So it's Duterte's independent foreign policy, and it's a blank column, right? And sadly, it's my most read article ever. I think friends have copies of it as a kind of a, classic moment. And I got trolled after that, legal harassment. That's a long story. But 2021 is essential because it was just 1 year ahead of elections. And I don't know if you know this guy, Manny Pacquiao, right? Manny Pacquiao wanted to run for president. And he was from Duterte's own party, PDP Laban. And he suddenly became a hawk. He would send a letter to the Chinese ambassador saying, what on earth are you doing? So Duterte was noticing like, whoa, this is, so he was smart enough to realize this is becoming untenable. Not to mention no investments, bullying continuing, militarization continuing. So it's not true that Marcos started. This was already starting. Now, speaking of Marcos, I'll go quickly through this. Nowadays, I hear from my pro-China friends, and some friends literally in China messaging me, saying, Richard, what's going on with Marcos? What did the Americans pay him? I said, there must be some dodgy deal there, right? Like that's the theory. Of course, my first reaction is, wow, you guys care about good governance nowadays. I didn't know about that, like I didn't hear a lot of good governance concerns when Duterte was in power. So that's a line coming out of China nowadays, which is Americans offered the Marcoses something. Now, I may get into trouble. Obviously, Biden doesn't control the courts, no matter what Trump says. As you know, Marcoses, because of their stellar record, have multiple court cases. There's, I think, a contempt case even against Marcos Jr. What Biden could offer is sovereign immunity, which is natural if you're a head of state. I won't be surprised. Maybe the Treasury Department is not looking into some Panama Papers report. I don't know. But the idea of them bribing Marcos and all, that's a bit ridiculous. And coming from my pro-China friends, like seriously, we want to talk about Duterte? The thing with Marcos is that he's a very shrewd politician. In fact, I'll say he's an OG, right? You can go on Google right now and type Marcos Jr. and Mao Zedong. So in 1974, together with his mom, he was part of that delegation that normalized bilateral relations between those two countries. We can have a debate about why he didn't graduate from Oxford or UPenn and all of that, but this guy has an instinctive understanding of high-stake geopolitics that no one in this room or perhaps in the Philippine political elite ever has had. And you know that in geopolitics, psychology is everything. To not be intimidated, to be yourself. And look at it, Marcos is 10 times more at home among world leaders than among people like me, for instance. Maybe he's more defensive or something. He's not a very good spontaneous speaker. He tried to do Duterte because Duterte, he's horrible in a sense that if you transcribe his speech, you're going to get a migraine. I literally had a migraine twice during his State of the Nation address. I'll tell you what. But he has the emotional impact. He'll drop jokes here and there. He knows where to stop. So he's like a master rhetorician, but a horrible speaker or writer or whatever. Marcos, clean, but like, once you ruin his rhythm, the questions he just loses it, right? So he tried once to be his own, because officially he doesn't have a spokesman. He tried once to be his own spokesman. Immediately he got called out for a statement he made about inflation, etc. I want to say something, but I'll say it off the record because, he said something like inflation is too high. And people made a story out of him saying too high, you know the implication, right? Anyway, going back to this, because I don't want this to be a stand-up comedy. I always resist it. Sometimes it's so frustrating I have to do that. Now, the thing is, Marcos is a shrewd politician. So, first of all, he maneuvered himself into presidential elections out of nowhere. Everyone thought he's done, right? He's done because he lost the vice presidential race in 2016. And in the Philippines, losers don't do very well until they do, right? So everyone thought it's either Duterte going to do a Medvedev-Putin move, meaning putting his factotum as his Medvedev and Senator Bongo, and then, or his daughter will run. The next thing that happened is those two fought against each other. So none of them run. Marcos has just come in and cut a deal and they call it Uniteam. So suddenly Marcos goes from number 3 in the surveys, barely number 3, 15%, to suddenly 60% preferability because of that consolidation with Duterte's and the multiplier effect that comes with that. Because Filipinos, let's be honest, we are champions of the strong, right? Whoever is in, let's go there. So that's a bandwagoning effect. It did happen during that election. So initially Marcos, looking around saying, okay, I have many cases with the US. There's a Biden there. They're Democrat. They pretend to be, Democracy Summit, blah, blah. I'm not sure about the Americans. Now, I want to be with Duterte, their team, etc. So he started saying things that were music to the ears of China, right? I am for diplomacy. Duterte is absolutely right, etc. But as soon as his survey numbers were looking very good and almost inevitable, he sounds differently. So if you look at the few debates that he attended, because it's a long conversation, but in the Philippines, there's sometimes some new media group pops up out of nowhere, and then suddenly they have international awards that they don't even have websites. So he attended debates by one of those groups, right? Kiboloy's, this long conversation. I don't want to go there again. I'm really controlling myself here, right? So there he suddenly said something like, no, we'll send our warships. If there's and then when he won the presidency, even bigger margin than he thought, the first major speech he gives as a president-elect is to say, Biden was the first leader to call me. And that for me was interesting. Obviously, we all know probably Vanato was the first one who called him, but why would he say Biden was the first one to call me? And among the first 4 ambassadors he met, there was no China. There was Korea, there was India, there was the number 3 at the U.S. Embassy because Trump didn't allow for ambassador, blah, blah. So he was already signaling something different. And then this is where, I'll go very quickly through this. This is where you'll see the explanation why the Philippines where it's today. So as the Biden administration went for proactive courtship, right? Immediately you will have sovereign immunity. That's Wendy Sherman, number 2 back then going to Manila. Immediately sending Blinken, August. Boom, Kamala Harris is in Manila in November, goes to Palawan. Boom, in February next year. So that was very important. It was very reassuring to Marcos, and you could see he was feeling very comfortable with America. These things matter in politics, especially you're dealing with, certain types of leaders. The Chinese, for some reason, were not understanding what was happening. They thought they're going to get the same deal under Duterte, meaning getting the Philippines on the cheap, right? Now, just a side note, Duterte didn't get big ticket infrastructure investment, but a lot of online Chinese casinos came into the Philippines, and we can speculate about how many people became super happy with that. And so happy that we're still not banning these guys, despite everything, including pressure by China. You see, Marcos gave the Chinese Beijing, just to be clear, Beijing, Communist Party of Beijing, a chance. So 3 months into office, he suspended 3 major projects by China, railway projects, and told them, hey, you cannot do to me like what you did to, you cannot give me empty pledges, give me something. So the Chinese realized, okay, this guy is a bit serious. So essentially the idea was over the next week, don't worry, go to Beijing, we'll sort it out. And Marcos goes to Beijing. He goes to Beijing as his first major state visit, ahead of Tokyo, ahead of DC, exactly like Duterte. Because historically, Filipino presidents go more to the US, Tokyo, etc. So for China, it looks good. Except he goes to Beijing and read the whole 21-point blah, blah, blah. Nothing, no concession whatsoever. Not on the infrastructure investments, not on the South China Sea. The only thing they offered him is better communication channels. As if hotlines really work during crisis in the South China Sea. You can ask the Vietnamese if you don't believe me. Sometimes you call, no one is answering you. And if the foreign ministry answers as if they have power, they don't determine China's policy in the South China Sea. So you could see he was visibly bothered. And he only had 2 days in China. I don't know why so short. His father got 10 days in 1976, I think. I think he spent more time in China during Mao Zedong than Xi Jinping, who for me is the Mao with the money, but we can have a long conversation about that. So that fruitless visit, I think really made it clear to Marcos that these guys are not respecting us. We have no leverage. Let's change it. So just 2 weeks later, he travels a lot, right? But now I have no moral ascendancy to complain because I used to call him Magellan Jr. But so 2 weeks later, he's at the World Economic Forum. And suddenly our eloquent president, there's a part of the question and answer where he says something like, some of the things that keeps me awake at night, this kind of a 2 a.m., 3 a.m. American style thing, is the South China Sea. Suddenly, he's very bothered by the South China Sea disputes, right? And then the next thing you know, he's going to Tokyo and saying, we need a trilateral security framework with Japan and the US. And boom, next thing you know, not only he fully implements the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, when I say fully implements, meaning green light for Americans to preposition weapon systems. That's one thing that Duterte resisted very much. He gives them 4 additional bases, including 3 of them more or less facing Taiwan. This was essentially his power move, like let's shift gears. So this was a very defensive move. Unfortunately though, what happens here is folks in Beijing thought, no problem. You think, Marcos, you can do that? We have our friends in the Philippines. The vice presidency is Duterte. And former President Duterte goes in and does his own parallel diplomacy with zero coordination with the Philippine government. He pops up in Beijing just days before Henry Kissinger as special friend of China. he was essentially slapping Marcos in the face and saying, this is not the direction forward. And not to mention, he'll do his, he also has, remember that media I mentioned that pop out of nowhere? He also had a show on that where he just like runs right and left. He's not as eloquent as before, even by Duterte. But anyway, he talks about like there'll be nuclear war, will be Ukraine and all of that. Now, the problem with China is that instead of recalibrating, they press the Philippines even more. So they try to leverage their proxies in the Philippines to put pressure on Marcos. That didn't help because China has a 92% distrust rating in the Philippines, right? And 70% of Filipinos, according to the latest survey, want a tougher stance. China already had a negative 13 net trust rating before Marcos took over. Just look at the numbers. So China realizes maybe there's a limit to that. So what do? They push it again, this time in the South China Sea. So there were 3 instances of direct collisions between the ships in the last 6 months and 5 instances of water cannoning, including some that almost killed Filipino naval officers. As one Filipino naval spokesman told me, I said, let's make this pedestrian. If this is punching power, is this Mike Tyson or is it Pacquiao? He said both, right? And as you know, if Tyson alone punches you, you can have, you can expire, right? So, and to top it all, this is also a time of eerie silence by ASEAN. Almost totally nothing by ASEAN. Only 2 days before New Year, our good friends in Indonesia scramble something and they come up with some statement that was better than zero, but definitely nothing close to what we were expecting. So this is also where the Philippines is feeling isolated within the region, and that really, I think, created this situation we find ourselves. When the Philippines is feeling isolated in the region, China is keep on pushing the Philippines, and one reason also China is pushing things in the Philippines is also because, how can I go back? Okay. Because also they're worried about implications for Taiwan. Very quickly, I'll just go through this. So if you look at it, this is Philippines, this is Taiwan. It's extremely close. My hunch is, the reason why the Chinese are very aggressive on us here is tone deaf. They don't understand things are changing. But it's also because they're worried we'll give Americans more bases here. Maybe not here, it's too small, but many things can happen nowadays, right? So their worry is we will increase American presence here. So the more they're worried, the more they press us, except it's a blowback situation. It's a blowback situation because the more bully us, the more they empower China hawks in the Philippines. Believe me, they're more critical people than me in the Philippines, and really pro-American boys in the Philippines are saying, we go all in. In fact, the Philippines released the Comprehensive Archipelagic Defense concept or strategy, which essentially says, why do we only care about here, South China Sea, or ISIS people here, right? Moving through there. Of course, the Abu Sayyaf and all. We should have 360 degrees, which in theory is perfectly nice. But if you scratch the surface, it could also mean we need more American presence and friends all over here. And again, you can see the implication here, and you can see why Beijing would really get worried about that. Now, interestingly, Beijing is not free of its own options. One of the concerns we have is this interesting governors in some of these provinces. So if they cannot get the national government, there's always the LGU diplomacy, right? And one of the concerns is that some of the politicians and LGUs in northern part of the Philippines are openly parroting the China line. I'm sure it comes deeply from their heart and their conscience, but they're concerned about that. And as we speak, these people are being eased out on election irregularities, etc., most notoriously in the case of Mamba. Even more interestingly, Amy Marcos, the older sister who thinks is smarter and the one that should have been the president, she's also starting to openly criticize her brother's foreign policy. And she just happens to be the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. I wrote once about this. There was a reaction from their side, so I stopped talking about the sibling stuff and all of that, so let's not go there, okay. So as we speak right now, and I didn't mention, I don't know if you have checked it, in the Philippines there's also this new revelation that there are certain mayors that we don't even know if they're Filipinos at all. Of course, we have a large Chinese Filipino community, no problem, but we have this curious case of this certain the mayor in Bamban, Tarlac, where the Aquinos come from, and this is not too far from Clark Air Base, but it's actually also close to crucial military facilities. And there are many theories. One theory is she's just a, as the Soviets nicely put it, useful idiot. She says she's a love child, etc. That's why she cannot provide a legit documentation that she was ever born in the Philippines. So many problematic answers. It's a circus in the Philippines. There are all sorts of memes about her. She says, I just grew up in a farm. Next thing you know, she has a chopper, apparently a McLaren, or at the very least 16 different cars. And all of them were purchased from the years 2020 to 2023. Just, when there was an explosion of online casino. And she's associated with an online casino in the Philippines. Remember I discussed that was caught also hacking government websites and doing some surveillance activities. So we really don't know is she like deep penetration agent? Or this is like Sicario, right? Have you watched Sicario? It's like, oh my God, what's going on? It's like liquid situation, like double infiltration. Or she's just like a girl having a good, we don't know. It's weird, really weird. So right now there's a discussion about maybe we have to check all mayors near the towns because suddenly people are popping up right and left. So if you go to her town, there are people who say, we never saw this one. She just popped up in 2022. Some call her openly as a Chinese mayor. And in fact, more sophisticated people said, because Filipino Chinese are mostly Hokkien, right? So she was quizzed on her mastery of the Hokkien language. Because if she came straight from Beijing or up, she shouldn't be very good or she will have certain accent. So it's weird, and it's an ongoing conversation, and I don't want to get libel cases or anything like that, but check it on your own. It's a Netflix thing. Just when I thought Duterte is Netflix or Kibolo, I didn't discuss it. This is even more Netflix than all of that. Like Philippines is a creative, hub nowadays. There's just so much material out there. In fact, one of the things that does very well online is all of her pictures, because she's very open about her new in her Novo-rich lifestyle. There are all sorts of fashion websites where they analyze the cost of each of her items. And I think she had a serpentine Bulgari worth $500,000 or I think something like that, right? So anyway, you can check that. So Philippines, this is the stuff of Netflix. Anyway, just to end on this note so that we have a little bit of time for discussion. The one debate we have right now in the Philippines is, are these enhanced defense cooperation agreements? Remember, after 1990s, we cannot allow Americans to have permanent bases. That's unconstitutional right now. The EDCA is a mechanism that allows for Americans to have rotational access. So it's not permanent because you rotate people, but some would say, well, but that's kind of permanent. So anyway, there's some postmodern legality there we can have it. But they cannot have what they have to have, they used to have, which is these giant bases in SARS. But nevertheless, some people are saying maybe we can give them more bases. And then Marcos himself is sending mixed signals. No, they could be used for contingency or not. My idea is maybe Marcos is looking here at possibility of using this as a bargaining chip. My position is, and many would disagree with me, is the Philippines can easily say to China, if you don't give us what we need, which is stop harassing us on Second Thomas Shoal and allow us to fortify it, we'll give Americans everything they want on Taiwan, right? That could be a leverage point. As long as, again, you can do hedging short of possibility of war. So if your assessment is a war in Taiwan is unlikely for 100 reasons, this is a leverage thing we can do. But there are there are experts and military experts who disagree with me and say, no, the Taiwan war is a distinct possibility, and China taking over Taiwan is even worse than us losing small islands in the South China Sea, right? Because then you'll have PRC as your immediate neighbor to the north, very close to Luzon and our critical bases, etc. Some are saying what we're doing right now is unnecessarily provocative, but the counter argument to that is without risk, there are no rewards. Without risk, there's no respect. And so, and we saw in the case of both Malaysia and Indonesia, when they held their ground, when West Capella and Petronas went for unilateral exploration in 2021, when Indonesia stood up to China in North Natuna Sea in 2020, there are times that China actually backs off if they feel you are self-respecting enough. But I cannot blame China. They had Duterte for so many years, so they kind of got used to, the call. Things were so weird in the Philippines that there were times, Duterte come from a southern city called Davao. I love them. They're fantastic people. There were times that Chinese military airplane would just pop up out of nowhere in the city, and then when officials in Manila were asked, we don't know about that. And then the Chinese would say, no, we directly coordinated with the president's office. So you had that weird situation back in the day. Or Chinese warships will pop up in Davao. And that was scary because we have no visiting forces agreement. So if those Chinese officers engage in something nefarious or one of them got, stabbed or something, good luck with the legalities of that. That's why you need SOFA and VFA, right? But anyway, weird things were happening back then. So I think it kind of spoiled our Chinese friends. And when our Chinese friends say they have a gentleman's agreement with Duterte that will essentially allow them to have their way, Honestly, I trust China more than Duterte. So I think the Chinese are genuinely troubled. Like, but he agreed to it, you know? We don't even know if Duterte passed it down to his own people. He has also a tendency of just saying yes, yes. Maybe he didn't even understand what the Chinese were saying in terms of implications. So much is going on. So as we speak, there are also investigations on that front. The Philippines is now an investigation, paradise. Like there's 12 different investigations going on. It's a good time to be a senator and congressman nowadays in the Philippines. Can the Philippines do multi-alignment like India and Vietnam? You can see the implications. By sheer distance from tyranny or tyranny of distance, we cannot. And we're a US treaty ally already, so I disagree with that. There are things we can learn from our neighbors, but we're in a completely different geopolitical position. But does that mean we cannot hedge? We can have a discussion about that. Lastly, is Philippines really an exceptional case, meaning an ASEAN outlier? Or we're just seeing a variety of Philippines and a snapshot of region whereby we're a little bit away from the rest of the region? Because in 2017 and 18, the most critical country of China was Mahathir of Malaysia. And then that changed the next year. So maybe this is an unfair snapshot in a very fluid situation. And fluidity is exactly why, in my opinion, Southeast Asia now is one of the sexiest geopolitical contexts for you guys to study. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your violent reactions and criticisms. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was a lot.
Ooh, sorry.
Any questions? I think